Now, you mentioned a lot of the behind the scenes intrigue and setting up the tournament. Indeed, the book opens with the negotiations about the referees for the eighth and final game. Was there ever a moment where the fate of the whole tournament was in jeopardy?
Well, it was the debate over the referees before Game 8 because Al Eagleson and Harry Sinden said they weren't going to play if the West German referees were on the ice. And we spent hours and hours and hours negotiating this and eventually came up with we said we would each choose one referee. And we chose the Swede, Uwe Dahlberg. And then we were told he was sick, but we had breakfast with him in the morning, and that turned out to be a political illness. So there was the chance the series wouldn't have had the Game 8. Also in Montreal, a Canadian had his car crushed by a Soviet tank in Prague, Czechoslovakia in 68, and he put a lien on the Soviet equipment. So there was a chance that the Soviets wouldn't have had any equipment to play in the game. So there are a number of incidents where this series may not have happened even after we had negotiated the arrangements for it.
Now, the hockey legacy seems to be the opening of the NHL to more foreign players and a change to a more European style of play after the Summit Series. How does it feel for you to have been a part of that?
Well, it feels great because at the time in 1972, about 98% of the NHL players were Canadian. And today we're down to around 43%. So hockey is really internationalized. The other thing this series did was, nobody really trained during the summer. Hockey players sort of drank beer and sold beer. The idea that you had to have a diet as an athlete, that was, wasn't common practice at the time. And when we saw the Soviets play, we realized, gee, these guys are in great condition. And we learned that diet is important for athletes, year-round training, and dry land training, particularly running. And all those things came back to Canada. There was a Canadian coach called Lloyd Percival who had written this out in the early 50s. We didn't pick it up, but the Soviets did, and they used a Canadian technique to train their players up so that they were in terrific shape.
Now, when we talk about the political legacy of the Summit Series, you explain this power of teamwork concept in the book. Do you think that hockey can build bridges between East and West again, as it did in 1972?
I think it's possible. The invasion of Ukraine it's a terrible situation. We were going to have all kinds of ceremonies this year to celebrate the 50th anniversary. Russian players were going to come here. We were going to go over there and so on, and coins and stamps and big banquets. But all that got scrubbed. And a lot of the junior games have been canceled. The international tournament in St. Petersburg next spring is canceled. But there's still around 55 Russian players in the NHL, and many of them are stars of the game right now. And so I think it still is a bridge. It's still a way for us to connect to Russians. We're going to have to deal with Ukraine one way or another, militarily, politically, as time rolls along here. And that hockey bridge is still there. It still is something that we have in common with the Russians. And, I mentioned that Canada ground to a halt in September of 1972. Everybody in this country wanted to see this series. But at the same time, we estimated that there were 150 million Soviet citizens who watched the series on their television. So it has a great appeal. It is something that we have in common with the Russians. And, when I've gone back, I was back last year, I was back 5 years ago, they're still talking about this series. They know all the Canadian players from 50 years ago. So it had a massive impact, and it still does. And I still think the hockey bridge, even though we've had tanks going over it, is still a vehicle for us to improve our relations and have some common ground with the Russians.
How do you want the Summit Series to be remembered, and what do you hope people get out of the book?
Well, it was people say it was the greatest hockey series ever. Uh, the, uh, the greatest moment in Canadian sport when Paul Henderson scored with 34 seconds to go. Team of the century. It was the first time that Team Canada was used. We never called our teams Team Canada before that, and now every international team we have, whether soccer or basketball or whatever, is Team Canada. And it was a moment where we reached out. We thought we were really great. We were humbled in Montreal, humbled in Vancouver, but we came back. And that spirit of coming back and digging deep and not giving up to the very end, I think, is one of the greatest legacies of that series.
The name of the book is Ice War Diplomat: Hockey Meets Cold War Politics at the 1972 Summit Series. It's available from Douglas and McIntyre. My thanks to Gary J. Smith.
Thank you very much.